Believe it or not, I'm from a time where the term deathcore didn't even exist.
I'm an old man. I don't care. I just don't care.
But today we're ranking one of the big ones with the albums of Suicide Silence. And we are starting with The Cleansing in 2007. Now this is very much a big forerunner album for the genre. Like, it's far from the first deathcore album, but along with Whitechapel's debut, this is definitely a big benchmark release that helped to launch the genre to a bigger audience and sort of set the blueprint moving forwards for a lot of bands in the late 2000s. Some real classics here. Unanswered is a killer opener that really just kicks the door down, and Hands of a Killer brings that super infectious groovy hook. Great build up and break in the intro going into the screams. Mitch's variety in the vocals really adds to the texture of the songs, and his delivery always gets me screaming along. He was just so great at the one-liners like on Pity for a Coward. The drumming on this album is also quite good, especially on tracks like The Price of Beauty. Love that pingy dodgeball snare tone. That groove on In a Photograph gets me every time. The Disease hits hard, and I also love Destruction of a Statue, which is actually a hidden track, but one of my personal favorites with those banger riffs. Super brutal and aggressive. It's a little inconsistent, but especially for a debut, it's very strong. It even came out at number 94 on Billboard Top 200 and became one of the best-selling debut albums in Century Media's history, so I'm putting this one at S tier. They followed that up with No Time to Bleed in 2009. More great songs. Wake Up is another deathcore anthem with those jangly guitars and larynx shredding vocals. Love the little guitar earworm effect on Lifted as well. The intro to Smoke has kind of an industrial chimera feel to it in both the guitars and that eerie noise in between the chugs before it completely lets loose. The title track is another classic, getting downright brutal, and that final 30 seconds or so is
legendary. No time to...
Now this is probably going to be the first of a few hot takes, but while I stand by many of the high points on this album, I think it kind of falls off just a bit in the second half with fewer standout tracks than the debut overall. And I also don't really like Machine's somewhat muddier sounding production. Even so, another really solid foundational album, and the fans loved it, as evidenced by jumping up on Billboard, this time to number 32. I'm going to put it at A tier. Then we got The Black Crown in 2011. This is a bit of a divisive album that fans seem to either love or hate. Some think of it as kind of like a sellout record, but personally, I really love it and think it was the natural evolution of their sound. Some of the riffs are a little bit slower this time, kicking off strong with the groove of Slaves to Substance, but what we lose in speed, they make up for in good songwriting. And they wear their obvious nu metal influences on their sleeves at this point, right down to the Jonathan Davis guest feature on Witness the Addiction. Of course, there's the classic You Only Live Once, which I'm sure got them a lot of new listeners with the popularity of the music video, and that impossible not to scream along with chorus. It's the perfect balance of heavy and catchy. Then there's the grindy D-beat driven Human Violence and shredding Cross-Eyed Catastrophe. Love the backing vocals on the latter from Alexia Rodriguez of Eyes Set to Kill. And if those still aren't heavy enough for you, they still keep the death metal cred strong with Suffocation's Frank Mullen guesting on Smashed. All of this captured by some pretty massive sounding production from Steve Evans, who has worked on some of my favorite albums. The Number 12 Looks Like You's Worse Than Alone, Every Time I Die's New Junk Aesthetic, and the entire The Dillinger Escape Plan discography. This is actually the album that I go back to the most when I'm in the mood, and it may be a controversial pick, but I'm going to go ahead and also put this one up at S tier. Sadly though, Mitch died in 2012 from a motorcycle accident, so this would be his final album. Which brings us to You Can't Stop Me in 2014. In comes vocalist Eddie Hermida of All Shall Perish fame with some big shoes to fill. It reminds me a little bit of what The Witcher is going through now with Cavill stepping out. That said, I think he does a very good job with the whole band bringing their A-game here. Inherit the Crown in particular always ends up on my Suicide Silence playlists, feeling like it could have come right out of the earlier albums with more great riffs and scream-along lines. And of course, Corpse Grinder himself of Cannibal Corpse guests on the super heavy Control. As does the Dillinger Escape Plan's Greg Puciato on Monsters Within. Cease to Exist goes hard with riffs straight out of the debut, and Sacred Words brings both technicality and infectious grooves. The title track was actually written by Mitch and ends up being kind of a bittersweet swan song for him. They needed to come strong with this one, and I think they did an excellent job, and truth be told, on this latest re-listen, I liked it a lot more than I did originally, maybe even as much as No Time to Bleed, but for now, I think I'm going to put this one at B tier. By the way, if you're enjoying the video, be sure to hit the like button and comment your own thoughts down below. But next up, we have Suicide Silence in 2017. Oh man, this is one of the most memed on metal albums of all time. Like, I honestly felt kind of bad for just how much shit they took for this thing, but I gotta say, I think it's pretty overhated. It's by no means a great album, but in a way I really respect them for trying to shake things up, because again, having Eddie really kind of spread his wings and try a completely different approach was honestly kind of refreshing. For all of the jokes about Doris, as someone who grew up in early nu metal, I kind of dig it. Like, it sort of reminds me of days spent in my teenage years listening to early material from Korn, Deftones, and Slipknot. There's also a little Mike Patton coming through on some of these songs, though Eddie of course doesn't have close to the same range, but a few like Dying in a Red Room could end up on like a Tomahawk album with its Captain Midnight vibes. Silence and Hold Me Up, Hold Me Down have some even more overtly early Korn sounding moments that get me bobbing my head. That said, I'll admit that Run, The Zero, and Conformity kinda suck and end the album on a sour note. Those tracks aside though, I think that if this were released by another band in the early 2000s when nu metal was king, people might have loved it. And if it's been a while and you're just kinda going off of memory, all I ask is that you at least give it a fresh listen before passing judgment. I'm gonna put it at C tier. Next up, Become the Hunter in 2020. Now, while that last album was a flop, this one felt like an overcorrection to me. Like, it feels like a band licking its wounds and begging the fans to come back, even if their heart wasn't fully in the music. They're back to deathcore, but with none of the original energy or flair, if you ask me. Like, even after all of these re-listens year after year, I still can't tell you a single riff off the top of my head. Sure, tracks like In Hiding are super heavy, and then Skin Tight has some atmosphere to it, but they're ultimately just very forgettable. It's not terrible, it's not Nightmares of the Decomposed levels bad, but say what you will about the self-titled, at least that album is interesting, whereas I just don't think this one is. It's kind of like how I felt about Whitechapel's Mark of the Blade, just super generic riffing, and it's just missing those earworm vocal moments. I also think that part of the issue is by now, deathcore had just sort of moved on from this sound with great new releases just the year before from Carnifex, Fit for an Autopsy, Infant Annihilator, Shadow of Intent, Brand of Sacrifice, and To the Grave. I will say that at just under 40 minutes, at least it's not a slog. I don't hate it this time like I did when I first heard it, and if I were to highlight one track, it would probably be Disaster Valley. I think I had this at D tier last time. I'm also going to put this one at C tier. And that brings us to Remember,
You Must Die
in 2023. So after those last two, I had low expectations going into this new record, but then they dropped Thinking in Tongues, which basically brought back all the best elements that got me into Suicide Silence to begin with. Followed a few months later by Capable of Violence, NFW, pairing a somewhat chuggier, more brutal arrangement with a great sense of humor in its gore-filled music video. Things were definitely looking up for this album, and I think it at least somewhat delivers on the return to form fans were looking for thanks to head-bobbing groovers like Fucked for Life, Kill Forever, and the eerily plotting Altar of Self. as well as straight rippers like God Be Damned, Endless Dark, and The Third Death. The biggest weakness, though, is still that these songs lack the memorable, infectious quality of their earlier material. Like, right from the start, the intro and title track pack a solid punch to open things up, but where's the hook of something like Unanswered or Wake Up? And oddly enough, my favorite track released in the lead-up isn't even on the album, with my other personal standouts much deeper in the runtime with the solid riffs of Closer, Full Void, and Dying Life just before that. So it's a good album, I enjoyed it. But again, while this album might have impressed me more back in like 2014, there are just so many new projects in the mix now doing much more interesting and exciting things with deathcore. So if you love Suicide Silence and yearn for the stripped back sound of the genre's early years, you'll probably enjoy this album. But if you've since progressed on to things like Darko and that great new album from To the Grave, it might sound a little bit quaint. So I think this one ultimately fits pretty squarely at B tier. Y'all check out this playlist for more deathcore videos, including my ranking of Whitechapel, and let me know your rankings down in the comments. But that'll do it for now. Flight of Icarus signing off. I will see you in the trenches.